think I broke
Unlike
a fiddle
Uncle
player.
Bonsai, we don't have to pay for this by the inch.
Yes. They have a live recording where they mention that.
We're ready for episode 3, Proteus. Now, before we get cranking here, let's talk a little bit about the Odyssey and the corresponding Proteus chapter in the Odyssey. So, quickly, because again, we're not doing an adaptation of the Odyssey. That's not what Ulysses is. We're shadowing it. So just a little background is sufficient. Proteus is a Greek sea god. So he's out there with Neptune and some of the other sea guys. He's the god that's over the creatures of the sea. He lives on a sandy island, which is interesting because most of this episode takes place on Sandy Mount Strand. Now, here's the interesting stuff. For Proteus, the name of this episode, his main characteristics are, number one, he is a shapeshifter. He has the ability to become different things. So he can turn into a seal, he can become a starfish, he can be a sea slug, he can turn into a bird, he can become any creature, so he can shapeshift. He also knows the past, obviously the present, and the future, and when I say the present, he means all of the present. So not just where he is, but he knows what's going on everywhere. So he is it's kind of omniscient, but I don't know that he's brilliant. He just knows everything that happened in the past, everything that's going on in the present, and he knows the future. Whether he understands it all, I don't know how deep he is, because I think that would give him superpowers, beyond superpowers. But enough on that. Now, there's one little trick component with Proteus. So he's a shapeshifter, and he knows the past, present, future, but he doesn't like to divulge what he knows. And that's very important to this whole episode. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, now, a couple of thoughts. This is the first really challenging episode. Up to now, pretty intelligible. There's a lot of hidden meaning and stuff. There's symbolism, and we've talked about that. You hit this episode, and it's pretty challenging right out the chute. I mean, as soon as it starts, it's rough going.
Allerta, allerta.
So half the time you're going to be wondering, what are they even talking about? Okay, now, when that hits you, and it'll hit you pretty quick, because I think even the first word makes this a little confusing, so don't let that throw you off. But when this starts to get rough going, remember what I told you about Proteus, that he's a shapeshifter, and he doesn't like divulging what he knows. So he's going to conceal information from you, and he's always changing. So that's really important. So when you read stuff and you can't really digest it or understand it, hey, look, it's not all you. right? The language is confusing, obviously. The subjects jump around, and even the sort of relationship of space and time move around. You know, are things going fast? Are they going slow? Was he moving, not moving? There's a lot of references to space and time in this episode. So you have a lot of confusing components. That's because of that character Proteus. So this is your first really tough episode to deal with. And this is where a lot of people stop. They get through the first couple and then they hit this one and say, oh, this is why I don't read Joyce. All right? But I think knowing these things, you ought to be able to just keep rolling. All right? So even though it's tough, let's talk about it a little bit and see if we can turn it from a barrier into something actually pleasurable. And this just might end up your most favorite chapter so far. Even though you think, oh, you got to be crazy, Chris. I mean, those first two, at least I could understand them. This one is like, no way. You may find yourself looking back and say, wait a minute, this is pretty neat stuff, actually. All right. So as we move forward, we think about Proteus. Now, always remember, he doesn't want to be clear. He's a shapeshifter, so he's intentionally not clear. That's what this is sort of revolving around. So if you had a character like that, how easy would that person be to understand, to digest? If you could get inside their head and they didn't want to be understood, that would be rough. Now, make that person a genius. So with Stephen, we're dealing with a really smart guy to begin with. And he likes to think intellectual thoughts, and he likes playing with words, and he has this amazing vocabulary, and he has all this literary and philosophical stuff to draw from. So that's enough. You know, we've dealt with that in the past 2 episodes, that he's confusing enough when you get inside his head, and this internal dialogue is really confusing to follow. So keep that in mind. Now, as you go through the chapter, here's some things we can expect. Obviously, the jumping around. There's going to be confusion with the language and confusion in space and time. And there are going to be predictions of the future. So there are going to be many allusions in this episode about things that are coming, though that won't be clear to you right now. But later you'll look back and say, I remember there was a reference to that. Okay? And I'll point out a couple, and then you'll find your own. Because we're reading for fun. All right? Now, one little sort of interesting side note on Proteus. Proteus is where we get our word protein. And proteins, interestingly, are a basis of life. And that's sort of the beginning point of life. Proteins can change shape, interestingly. And also proteins really are not fully understood. And there's a lot of studies on proteins. Proteins can fold in innumerable ways, and when they make their odd foldings, they produce different results. Mad cow disease is a result of odd protein folding. So there's a lot of strange stuff. And then think about what mad cow disease is. And, you know, you can see how this book can just start to grow. It's like yeast. It just takes on a life of its own and expands forever. But I thought you might find that interesting about Proteus and protein. Now, let's walk through this episode. Now, you've made it through the first 2, and you hit episode 3, and you start to read, and you get this ineluctable modality of the visible. Right, I mean, sentence 1, there you are. Punch, right? Right off the bat, there you are. Brutal start. What does this mean? This ineluctable means that it's inescapable. Now, when he talks about the ineluctable modality of the visible, what he's saying here is that it is impossible to escape forming your belief, opinion, how you perceive something based on your vision. You can't escape that. You see a rock, you form an opinion about a rock, you think you perceive many of the characteristics of that rock accurately because of your vision. Now, have you ever done something like you look at something like maybe a glass that you think is full and it's not, it's empty, and you go whoop, like that because you expect it to be heavy and it isn't, because strictly going by vision doesn't give you a full view. Now, I'm not going to go all into the philosophy behind this. You can look it up. But this goes all the way back to Aristotle. And, can we trust what we see? Can we trust our perceptions? Is sight enough? We have other senses that help us get data. But if the sight is faulty, then maybe the other perceptions are faulty as well. I see things in a particular way. When I look at things, I know how they look to me. I don't know how they look to you, and it's impossible for me to know how things look to you. Now, we have general agreement. We both describe something, and it seems like our descriptions are in alignment, so maybe our perceptions are fairly accurate, but we don't know 100%. I don't know exactly what you see, and you don't know exactly what I see. So this ineluctable modality of the visible is just talking about the inescapable conclusion that we draw based on what we see. That's all that means. So it comes down to you can't escape what you see influencing what you believe. That's the bottom line on that. So even though that sounds all complicated and where are we going with this, that's what that means. You can't escape what you see influencing what you believe. That's a rather important concept for this episode. Now, let's talk about Joyce for a minute. And this is pretty incredible stuff. He had this very serious eye condition. Very serious iritis. He was losing his vision. He had a number of treatments for it. He underwent surgeries. They couldn't do anesthesia in those days. They didn't have antibiotics in those days. So it was pretty much lie down, hold your eyes open. They put a couple of drops of cocaine in his eyes and then just start whacking, cutting, draining, all kinds of pretty nasty stuff. He had excruciating pain and severe vision impairment. So Joyce would have to read with the big eyeglass trying to make out words. It's a big struggle for him. So it makes one wonder about this allusion to this vision and perception and beliefs. And he's a writer, and he is also very almost obsessive about detail. And he can't see well at all. And he's brilliant, and he's poetic, and he's a genius with words. So you have this guy that can greatly describe stuff, but he can't see it very well. I mean, I think that's interesting, and a parallel to that might be Beethoven. Beethoven, you have this great composer, maybe arguably the best composer ever, certainly on the top 5 list with Mozart and a few others. Deaf. So you have this brilliant composer, can't hear what he's doing. He writes the Ninth Symphony, one of the great pieces of music in the repertoire, and he never heard it. I mean, that's a phenomenal thing. Now imagine if you could get inside the head of Beethoven. So you have this genius guy that can write this incredible music, and it's brilliant, and you're inside that mind, and he can't hear. So you're going to get the genius, the ideas, the concepts flying around, and the frustration of not being able to hear it, not being able to play it out, and how does this sound, and can I fix it? He has to do it all in his head. Can you imagine what it would be like to crawl inside that mind? This leaves me with a tangle of Joyce's brilliance, but it also leaves me kind of sad. You know, there's a pitiful component to that, which makes it's a little painful, but it's all part of Joyce's genius. So I hope that you can take that with you into this episode, because it is confusing and the language is difficult. But don't worry about that. Just let it kind of wash over you. Understand what you can of it. Just read and grasp and see that you're walking around inside the mind of a frustrated genius. And Stephen is Joyce's alter ego. Now, we have this statement about vision affecting what you see, and that's inescapable. That's what that ineluctable means. And what does Stephen do? He closes his eyes and he walks like a blind guy, and then he talks about his ash plant, his walking stick, and he says, you know, tap it. That's what they do. And so he's walking and he's thinking to himself. So you have him closing his eyes, walking, and he says, gosh, what if I walk off a cliff? You know, he's just the things that go through his mind. So he closes his eyes and he thinks to look at this idea of sight influencing his perception and what he believes. And so he goes by what is in his mind and his other senses. Watch that. Just get through as much of that as you can. What you don't grasp, you don't have to go launch a research project. It's not important. The only thing that's important is the idea behind it. We're going up inside the mind of a genius. This had not been done before in writing, where the real thought process was explored. That had not been done. All prior internal monologue was linear. It was almost like the story. You didn't know that's what they were thinking. You see the line, he thought, or she thought, or he contemplated, you know, where they're thinking, they tell you exactly, they're thinking this, and then it's like a mini story. You wouldn't know that it was a thought rather than a speech unless they said he thought. Joyce crawls up in the brain and sees, how does this really work? And the mind is not linear. It jumps all over the place, and ideas pop in and they vaporize, and we think and we lose our train of thought. Then we get new ideas from what we see, and that sparks other things, and we jump subjects and we go all over the place. That is amazing writing to get that right. And we're not dealing with some schmo. We're dealing with a brilliant mind that we're crawling up in, so it's a little extra difficult. Themes in this episode. Now, remember Stephen's quote from the previous episode that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. All right, now, great quote. I love that quote. So, history is woven into this episode. You'll see a few references to history. That matters. The birth, life, death cycle, numerous references. And this is always a theme throughout the book anyway. We see birth, life, death. You know, we have some very interesting stuff coming up about that whole cycle there. But on the strand, as Stephen walks, there are a number of things that refer to the birth, life, death cycle. Watch for those. Pay attention. Those are easy to find. They're not club you over the head obvious, but they're easy to find. You don't have to get into the what does he mean in French, and this is some allusion to a piece of literature from the 16th century. None of that. It's very obvious stuff. Also, another theme in this chapter is the father-son relationship. Again, is brought out. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's brought out. So, what happens in this episode? Let me just kind of piece it together so as you read it, you know what's going on. It starts with Stephen is walking. He's left the school. He's walking. He's going to visit his uncle's house. Now, this uncle is his mother's brother. Now remember, his mother is recently deceased. Stephen is still in mourning. He's wearing black, and he decides he's going to go visit their family. When he gets there, there's a reference to they thought he was the dun. That's the D-U-N. It's the bill collector. So, they kind of peek out and close the curtains, and it's like the bill collector's coming. And that's why they say, well, we thought you were somebody else. Somebody else is the bill collector. There's a lot of humor throughout this episode, and this visit to the uncle's house is laden with it. There's a lot of funny stuff in that. So after he visits, or during the visit, out comes the drink. Okay, so that's the downfall of every Irishman, and this family is broke. He asks him, do you want something to eat? Stephen says no, and he says, good, there's nothing in the house but back bills. Interesting. Kind of a parallel to today, actually. But, yeah, there's no food in the house because they're dead broke, and they're hiding from the bill collectors. Now, the uncle does have some work to do. He does some the bill processing, and he's like a warrant server, that kind of stuff, minor errand work for accounting and legal stuff. After Stephen visits his uncle, he goes out back onto the Strand, sits on a rock, picks his nose, urinates, and thinks about stuff. Okay. Now, what should we be looking for? What should we notice in addition to hunting out the themes? What we want to look for is, first of all, when he visits the uncle's house, why doesn't the aunt come out to see him? Now, they say, oh, she's washing the other kid, so she can't come out. But there's another reason she doesn't come out. And see if you can figure that one out. And if you can't, ask me a question in the comments, and I'll answer it for you. But I think you can figure it out, maybe. If you can't, let's talk about it. Look for the themes. Obviously, the themes are very interesting, so we want to look at those. But as you look at the themes, notice in Stephen's observations, he looks at things at a distance. Everything he looks at is from afar. He views the people on the Strand from afar, and his observations are somewhat detached. Now, watch for that and just try to get a grip on Stephen's personality and his viewpoint from that little clue that I just gave you, that he sees things from afar, and there's a certain detachment in the way he describes things. Now remember, this guy's a poet, so he sees life, and he sees detail, and he sees these things, and he can express them in the most interesting word arrangements. But does he really get it? Now, he's an intellectual, has a lot of fun with words, but does he really get it? Now, another thing that's interesting, I should say, is his reference to Eve. And he wonders whether, Eve has a navel. Now, she shouldn't have a navel. She was made, not begotten, so she would have no need for a navel. And he kind of gets a little clinical about that. She would have no need for the navel because she was made, not begotten. Pay attention to that reference, because later, when Bloom comes along, we're going to see a very similar interaction with a statue, and his take is going to be entirely different. So the Bloom take on life is very different from Stephen's take on life, and that's really important. So pay attention to how Stephen perceives things. Start with that first line, and he's looking at stuff, and how does he perceive everything? From afar, and a little bit of detachment, and then you can sort of look for the other references and get a feel for it. Love to discuss that in the comments. Stephen is missing something. There's a piece that's not there. And with Joyce, he too had a big piece that was missing. He resolved it. I don't know if Stephen will. We'll find out later. So let's wrap this up. I went longer than maybe I should, but I love this episode so much, and I want you to enjoy it. Even though it's the first brick wall, I want you to step back and look at it and say, wow, this is actually fun. Okay, so in closing, it is a hard episode, and I hope that this helps you clear some of the fog. Now, remember, this book, you're going to have to read it 100 times to get more and more and more and more to really get a grip on it. But it should be fun, all right? So I think this is enough that you can go through this chapter and actually enjoy it. I want you to enjoy it. And in spite of the wordplay, the humor, the irony, there's some little jokes in there, there's some funny expressions, you can't help feel a little pain. There's a little thread here that Stephen is missing something. And if you really pay attention and you get into it, you'll begin to feel that. And this chapter, this episode, really touches me that way, because I admire Joyce and I admire his writing, and I can feel this undercurrent of this thing that's missing, and there is this unresolved pain and this emptiness that's there. So I want to know what you think Stephen is missing. Give me your thoughts on it. Put it in the comments. If you're on a tablet, it'll say comments, and then you look, there's no place to put it. If you click there where it says comments, it opens up, and then you can put a comment. And if you don't see that, there's other videos underneath this video. Scroll way down there, and when you get to the bottom, there's a place for comments. So look around. I want your comments. That means a lot to me. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this opens up episode 3. And I hope you enjoyed the little opera snippet and a picture of the Strand, so you can kind of get a feel for all this. Thanks.